Welcome back. Welcome to the afternoon. For our next presentation, Hjort Guttu will give a short reading and then screen a film, and then have a discussion with the Walker's own director and curator of education and public programs, Nisa Mackie. By way of introduction for Hjort Guttu, Anna is an artist living in Oslo. She works in a variety of media, but has in recent years mainly concentrated on film and video works, ranging from investigative documentary to poetic fiction. Guttu's practice is concerned with individuals' everyday operation within larger structures, institutions of power, of labor, education, or politics that define and interpolate subjectivities. Among recent themes in her work are the relationship between freedom and power, economy and the public sphere and the public space, social change and limits of action. Between 2011 and 2016, she directed various portrait films in which a central conflict reappears, an individual dissident struggling to handle and subvert oppressive social structures. Guttu is also active as a curator and writer. Join me in welcoming Hjort Guttu.
Hello, nice to be here. Thank you, Nisa. Thank you, Walker Art Center. Thank you, Iflux, for inviting me. It has been wonderful the way all these different speakers somehow fit into a kind of totality together. And maybe I even got the idea that maybe we could reach some kind of conclusion. I don't know. It would be really nice. Immortality. Once I had a dream. I think it was in 2002. And it went as follows. I was in a town with a large art museum. The museum was new and exciting and had an immense collection. It was called the Big Museum, a name that was pronounced the Big Museum and accompanied by a sweep of the hand to show just how big it was. Everyone was talking about this museum. I was standing in a room face to face with some Giacomettis, and suddenly a man appeared beside me and asked if I myself was represented in the Big Museum. And I had to admit I wasn't, and I had hardly even visited the place before. He replied that I shouldn't let it bother me, because I could be part of the Little Museum instead. He explained that the Little Museum was secret. It had no collection, no management, and no building. It consisted of artists and their daily activities. People who made their art, had day jobs, and wrote applications, etc. All the things artists usually do. The Little Museum is nomadic, the guy explained self-importantly. It's where the artists are. That's how it stays informed about everything that's happening. Suddenly I was part of the Little Museum. I could carry on with my normal life, but the knowledge that I was part of the Little Museum gave me a sense of deep satisfaction, as if it were immensely important. But as the dream progressed, I discovered that everyone I knew was already in the Little Museum, which in fact turned out to be a kind of subsidiary of the Big Museum. The contact between the Little Museum and the Big Museum went via someone more secretive than secret could be. All the exciting things that happened in artists' lives, good conversations, studio visits, art production, all took place in the Little Museum, which was on the outside, but at the same time on the inside of the Big Museum, which meant that the Big Museum could gradually assimilate everything that happened beyond its walls. The last thing I remember from the dream was thinking that no one should ever know about the Little Museum. And I even have a picture of this secret guy. Maybe we can see it? Yeah. I found him on the internet. Yeah, so this dream, we can take him away again, actually. This dream came to my mind when discovering one of many notable proposals in this wonderful book, Avant-garde Museology. Ivan Lupol's outline of a network of museums based on dialectical materialism. His description is rather concrete about how it should all be organized according to orthodox Marxist principle. Base, economical and industrial museums, versus superstructure, art and so-called anti-religious museums. There should then be some kind of connection, or rather dialectical movement, between the two types of museums. And this connection is not thoroughly described in the text. My dream of the little and the big museum came about in the heyday of new institutionalism in Scandinavia, when many curators and artists alike had the idea that the institution or the museums could incorporate more or less everything from the social sphere, including the most marginal artists' daily life. But the notion of an institution or an artistic practice which contains everything is very natural to artists, as is the idea of secrecy. The little museum, which I described above, can only live on if its position in and connection to real life is maintained. Since museums habitually kill everything they touch, the little museum's museological status would have to remain secret. Perhaps the little museum has some similarities to what writer and activist Gregory Shollet calls dark matter. The vast majority of artists and cultural producers and consumers doing odd jobs, buying art books, running educational programs, working as technicians in the art museums, and making art in their spare time. Just like dark matter constitutes 95% of the actual physical universe, these cultural workers constitute 95% of the artistic field. And just like the universe would collapse without dark matter, art history and art institutions cannot live on without the dark matter of the art world. Shollet suggests that this dark matter constitutes a political and rebellious potential, precisely due to its exclusion from the higher circles of art life. An avant-garde museology would, within this logic, have to address dark matter, the little museum, such as it is. It should not be included in the museum, but rather constitute itself as something else, in a way that would secure its revolutionary outsider status. So this only as an introduction to my film, which is called Untitled, The City at Night. And this film somehow investigates this draft or this option, which I have outlined, through the work of an anonymous artist. She has to some extent tried out a similar strategy on a micro level. And she might be considered one of Schollet's dark and invisible heroines, with her own specific way of surviving.
Anna, thank you for joining us and sharing your work with us. I wanted to start with a question about the work that we just seen. And now I know you don't let it known whether this is a real life or a fictionalized situation. It's a secret. But I'd love it if you could tell me a little bit more about the work and its origins.
Yeah, but how to tell that if I cannot really tell if it's real or not? So very hard. But I think in general, I find it interesting because I think it contains thoughts that all artists deal with. And maybe particularly in times like this, actually, that we really think how to go on with our work, and could we do it in another way, which could somehow contain also the desperation that we somehow feel, all of us, I think. Yeah.
And in respect to the protagonist of the work, you know, she makes kind of like an ethical withdrawal from a framework in which her work would be received or seen or circulated. However, through you, she manages also to transcend that. She moves from being dark matter, as you referred to in the Charlotte piece, to something that's more visible. However, the space that she's afforded or created for herself is one of a certain kind of freedom. And I think the idea of freedom is something that you always seem to return to in your writing and in your other work. And it certainly feels like you create certain situations or fictions where you test different angles or scenarios around the idea of freedom. And I wonder if your relationship to this notion of freedom has changed over the years as you've turned it over in what you've made.
Yeah, it's true that I turn to this a lot, and a lot of my works are more or less about this, I think, about primarily individuals who somehow try to find ways to keep their freedom or expand their freedom, but who are at the same time in systems that feel so restricted that they almost have no way to actually deal with it, and therefore they develop maybe particular strategies, for example, like this one, where they still are able to feel free to some extent. I don't know, I have in the recent years maybe become more and more interested in courage also, because I think it's very much linked to freedom. How some people are able to step out of a system and actually say, I don't want to be in this system anymore. And for example, a person like Edward Snowden, how he, as one out of thousands of intelligence employees, actually went to this step and did it somehow. And I think that's very interesting. What's happening inside these people?
Mm. And I think actually related to your Snowden comment, and in this work too, there is this kind of relationship between visibility and transparency, and this idea of hope or of courage. In the intro or blurb that I had written for this session, I kind of wantonly used the term utopia, and now perhaps particularly in this current moment feels very inappropriate. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to this idea of kind of visibility and visibility. I think it kind of came through in your text about the big museum and the little museum as well, wherein there is this kind of subsection that is a secret, where there is a space for agency.
Yeah, I think these two, this text and the film, of course, have a lot in common when it comes to exactly this question, because it's both a kind of, they both contain a kind of premise or condition that to exist, it has to be somehow secret or invisible. Otherwise, it would be exploited somehow. Mm-hmm. And then you have to find ways of still revealing it. But because if no one knows, like Hito talked about yesterday, if no one actually see the work ever, it doesn't really exist when it comes to art. So you have to find ways to display it in one way or the other without actually taking away what's most precious in the work somehow. And I think, Lilo Sano managed to do this with Strike Piece, for example. So it's not impossible. I think we can actually find many different creative ways of maintaining the freedom of the work. I don't know exactly how this little museum should actually be. It exists because it's here, and we are all in this little museum somehow. But then we should maybe stop calling it museum. I don't know.
Mm. I guess this is connected to the idea of visibility, but you're also very present in a lot of your work, in your writing, in some of your filmic works where you take the position of narrator, or you construct certain situations even when you're not evident. There's still kind of a sense of you there, and in the situations that you kind of curate. And so how do you understand your own relationship to the kind of outside or inside of your own work?
I mean, in this work, I'm obviously inside my work, and that's necessary for me to be inside this work so that the protagonist can be outside of the work in a way. So in this particular work, I'm actually this guy that I showed the picture of, the kind of connection between the little museum and the big museum, because I am the one who connects her work to the art world, you could say. So in this particular work, I play the role as a kind of the artist who can somehow be inside the art world, while she plays the role or takes the position as someone who wants to be outside.
Mm-hmm.
So, and maybe that's actually very connected to the whole idea of participatory documentary film, for example, that you need to be there as the filmmaker just to relieve, to let others be more out of it somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Which is important when you're an artist, to actually let people be free in your work.
Mm. And then turning to some of your writing work, you're also very present in those spaces there as well. I mean, I particularly love certain pieces where you've taken a very sort of self-reflexive position as kind of writer, as autoethnographer, where you kind of put yourself in a certain situation and you kind of test the power relationships in that space. I'm thinking of there's a piece that you wrote, published in a book edited by Tone Hansen and Lars Bang Larsen, called The Pedagogical Paradox, I think. And you, Phantom of Liberty, thank you. And you write about an exhibition that you stage with your son, entitled Nature Exhibition. And the way that it unfolds is particularly fascinating in terms of your own sort of awareness of a sense of like epistemic humility, I guess, and awareness of your own sort of power in that space, and also your surprise at kind of his power in that space. And so I wonder, especially with your script writing, I mean, how did your writing practice evolve, and do you consider it a distinctive practice or a distinct practice from your filmmaking or your other works?
I think it's, of course, more or less the same as making my films or making other types of works. I find it much harder and more boring in a way. I think with art, I think the best part of it is to make things that you already know what to make somehow, when you can just do it. And everything is fun, like editing, filming, fixing, carpenting, and putting up exhibitions. While to actually find out about the work, what it's supposed to be, that's the hardest part, and I think it's the worst part also, actually. I think I have a really hard time doing it. And the writing is a very important part of that, because with filmmaking you have to write, of course, a lot, whether it's a documentary or fiction or whatever. But I think it's a super important way to actually become sure of what you're interested in. And I think pedagogically I teach a lot also, and I see that the students who write are more conscious about what they're interested in, and they become better artists, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's super important, but not for everyone, but yeah, it's a very important methodology, I think. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
I maybe to take it back to some of the previous sessions here at this symposium. You know, we've had Walid Rad talk about kind of like the flattening of work when it comes into the museum, or Hito talking about, you know, preventing leakages of the past, infiltrating the present. And these, I think that these presentations deal in some senses with kind of a poetics of reification and thinking about the objects in museums. And the protagonist in your film, you know, we were talking about kind of her freedom, but it's also difficult to understand what kind of like the limits or the boundaries of her, what she considers to be her work in that space, whether it includes the practice of the walking or it's the drawing itself that is produced. And I remember in another interview, I heard you say once that you wish that you could create art that could serve another purpose outside of the art world or the art space. And I wondered, had you envisioned what this might look like, or do you have an example of your own work where it's been repurposed or used or has expanded in some way?
Just to comment on what you said about the film, I think she doesn't really consider what she does to be art at all. So it doesn't matter for her whether her walks are art or part of the work. Or I just think that she sees it as a complete, an activity somehow, or something she does completely outside of notion of art. But yeah, have I really said that I wanted to make something? Yeah, okay. That would definitely not be, you know, like a bench, which is also an artwork or anything like that. But maybe, you know, it's super interesting actually to think of International Academy of Art in Palestine, because that started as an art project by a Norwegian artist actually, who wanted to put up an art academy in a kind of war zone. And he somehow chose Ramallah. And then he figured out very, very quickly that he couldn't really present this as his artwork because out of obvious reasons. And immediately when he started to work with people in Palestine, it was very clear that the status of being an artwork was not interesting for them. While they needed a school, they wanted a school. So I think that he just found out that it would be better to just leave the idea of the art project and just make or try to set up a school in collaboration with people in Palestine. And I think that was a very wise decision. So I think that it's more interesting when your art projects can somehow turn into something else and that you can forget about maybe them being artworks. Because I'm really suspicious to this status of the artist in that type of works and how they somehow monopolize both the concept of the work but also the content of the work and the people who try to deal with the project. So I think if I was to be making a work outside of the art world, it would be not art and just something else.
So I know we should probably go to questions from the audience soon, so I might just ask one more question. We heard from Boris Groys yesterday talking a little bit about the idea of utopia as not change, and I know Beth was very concerned with that idea, and we've had some discussions about this idea of hope or courage or utopia, which is probably not the best word, within some of your works, and I'm just curious to get your thoughts. You know, it's been an evolving conversation. It's just very difficult for me to think about a space where there is like no hope, no potential, or yeah.
Yeah, I think it sounds terrible. Utopia, isn't that a bit like paradise, a place where nothing happens and
and also
nothing
not
changes?
a
Yeah, I
place,
agree, and I think it's more like hell, maybe. So maybe paradise and hell is the same thing. I don't know. Yeah. No, I don't really know what to say about that.
I guess I think one of the interesting things that is seen across your work is this idea of kind of the potential in action, whether you want to call it a resistance or a thinking that is against, like a institutional structure or a framework for how people should be behaving, and there is this kind of like becomingness in those spaces that you can see that I think is very exciting to me. So perhaps it's more a comment than a question. And actually, it reminds me of an essay that Liam Gillick wrote about Anton's project Utopia Station, which was, if you kind of think about utopia as this kind of space of stasis, or it has like a thingness to it, then it kind of ceases to function as something that could be practically used for change. Okay, well, perhaps that's a good place to open up to questions from the audience. Oh, there's a mic coming to you.
To sort of build on this idea of utopia, there's that statement by Jameson, utopia is the place where ontology conflates with representation. And I wonder if in representing something wherein its actual veracity is unclear or deliberately ambiguous, what the end goal of that ambiguity is. Is that to point it more towards utopia, or?
You mean that the ambiguity of this particular work, for example, points to...
It either points to utopia, or at the very least sort of conflates ontology and representation, right?
There are very practical reasons actually for this work being a little bit unclear in that sense. But of course, why do we make all these mockumentaries or hybrid documentaries or docu-fictions or metafictions? Of course, it has to do with questioning whether it's productive to talk about truth or talk about the world in a certain way, whether it's actually more productive to see that things could be or could not be, but still have the same type of potential or the same type of power somehow. I think so.
Hi, thank you. I'm going to try to formulate this question. I guess what I really liked about the film in relationship to a theory of the artwork is that even though the protagonist doesn't want to call the practice that she's engaged in art and thereby escape certain things and expectations, she also seems really clear that there is criteria, like there's good and bad within still that practice that's not called art. And one thing that the protagonist said in explaining what it was she was doing was actually a kind of old theory of self-expression. And I'm just interested in if you see this protagonist as forwarding a good work, even if it's not art, so like an ethics. I'm interested in what is necessary, or like what is and what needs to remain, or what's important, what is the criteria for that practice? Because that protagonist seems so certain and deliberate about it. And maybe it includes like a certain kind of objectification of the self. I mean, that's one way of seeing expression. Like even if a viewer isn't required, it seems like a certain kind of concretization is. I'm thinking as opposed to the kinds of practices that we might think of as not art practices where they're merely and only performative. It seems like for this person, something must be made. So anyway, this is a long way of saying like, what is the criteria or what is indispensable? What is the ethics of the kind of non-art making that's represented in the film, if that makes sense?
Super smart questions here from the audience today and yesterday as well. I'm really impressed. Yeah, I think it's clear that she somehow relates to kind of almost modernist type of quality criteria, like this works, this doesn't work, this has balance, this has volume, this has colors, etc. And then she adds this invisibility somehow to it. And as she says also very clearly, it's a better work when it's not shown. So I guess she thinks that if it was shown, like, I mean, we can all imagine how it would be if it hung on the walls in a kind of museum, that it would look really old-fashioned maybe, or just, yeah, not so interesting maybe. So I guess she's right, actually, that it's better to when it comes out in my film. Maybe it's also a point to what Hito talked about yesterday with Guernica, who actually, when the picture comes out in this film as a kind of backdrop for this dinner table, it gets another content and another somehow weight, I think, which is of course very dubious, but still actually it works somehow also in this film. I just saw the still image, but still, yeah. So I think she's right, and that her work maybe actually demands this invisibility, and that in that sense it's more contemporary maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it also resonated for me a lot with what Walid Raad was saying yesterday about withdrawal and accessing, that we are only able to access the work indirectly, so through your film, which she made, I thought, very poignant statement about it, that I am protected by your work. And but my question was about the music in the film, if it has any relation with the scores that...
Actually, this last part of the film, which contains this movement and the composition, I made clearly by myself. And I asked the composer to compose to this movement. So it has nothing to do with her or... But I mean, of course, it's a kind of interpretation of her strolls through the city and how she might hear this music or think of this music, or how we all somehow could walk through the city and somehow imagine there coming violins in here, and so it's more like a visualization or a cinematization, if you could say that. Cinema, how would you put it? Cinematization. Yeah, of her idea, I think.
But also the thing Hito was saying yesterday about the museums, if they could act more like cities.
Yeah. And that's how I think this seminar is so wonderful, because everything like comes together. So I think that was really nicely put yesterday, and I could almost imagine how a museum could be a city.
Should we take one more question, if there is one?
I guess I had kind of a two-part question, building on the last two questions. One was that moment when, sorry, and I know it's kind of might be impossible to answer because there's ambiguity as to how this was produced, but that moment when she's describing, oh, when I'm looking at this now, I see myself looking at this tree, and your voice on the recording asks her, well, how is that? And she says, oh, well, you know, if you come to see it, and then quite soon after that, the image changes. So we're not really in a position to sort of stare at it for much longer, and it feels like there was a moment of sort of retraction there that's really important to the film. So I guess I'm kind of asking about that as an editing moment, or potentially as an interviewing sort of exchange moment, if you can speak to that. And then also whether or not there was a lot of time between knowing that you had the still images and then knowing that you wanted to take the camera onto the street and have the music, and how that transition or that sort of expansion of the work happened for you.
You mean the expansion to the last part of the film?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was really, I don't really know about that last part. I mean, I like it, but I cannot really explain why, because clearly it would be much more elegant if it was not there somehow. Still, I think it's important somehow to have it there, and I think that was just a feeling of wanting to engage maybe with her idea and her work in another way, and in a very concrete way for me. And when it comes to editing, of course, everything is edited from an interview, so I could decide exactly where I wanted to cut. So, but you were asking about this chestnut tree image.
It reminded me of, sorry, just it felt like a lot of things were actually being synthesized in the film from the last set of talks, and certainly there's been this sort of motif of both shadows and also the absent image in a mirror that turns up later. And there was something about her sense of seeing herself in watching or making, or the way that the shadow was working there that had a strange resonance. But also it seemed like there was something about the quickness or the interval of time between when she was, because there was a follow-up question that it provoked in you after she said that, which sounded genuinely sort of like just puzzled. How could this be the case? And she said, oh, well, very matter-of-factly, it's just there.
Yeah, I think she says after a while or after a long time, I started to show up in my own pictures. And then I suddenly thought about how would we know when we cannot really see her at all? I mean, it was just small squares. So, but I think it's super interesting how she somehow ends by saying, I am more and more in the pictures. So it's also a kind of maybe therapeutic almost, or process that she goes through, and that ends up with her being in the pictures, and and then it ends somehow, which I find interesting.
Great. Please join me in thanking Anna again.